In this video we look at the odd count peyote stitch. Stay with me and I'll show you how. If you are unfamiliar with the peyote stitch, check out my video on the even count peyote. I'll leave the link in the description. Where the even count peyote has an even number of columns, the odd count has an odd number of columns, which means we have to do a strange turn on alternate rows. There are many ways of doing this, and in this video I'll show you 3. We thread our needle with an arm span of thread, and we pick up an odd number of beads. I'm using size 8 seed beads, and I've picked up 5. We slide our beads down to the end of the thread, leaving about a 6-inch tail. We keep hold of the tail to stop the beads from falling off. I usually just wrap it around my finger. We pick up a bead. We skip over the first of the 5 beads we originally added, and sew back through the second bead, sewing in the direction of our tail. We should now have 2 beads stacked on top of each other, plus 1 bead on its own, with tail and working thread coming out of it. We pick up a bead, we skip over the next loose bead, and sew through the next. Now we come to the end of the row where we need to do our first strange turn. First we'll look at the figure 8 turn. We pick up a bead, we sew down the final loose bead in the opposite direction to the tail. And we should have alternating columns of 2 beads and 1 bead. Now we want to bring our thread back round to come through this bead we've just added. We sew up diagonally through this centre bead and the penultimate bead in the row we just added. We sew back through the bead below it and back through that centre bead. And we sew up through the final bead in the first row and back through the last bead in the last row. And we're now in position to add more beads for our next row. We pick up a bead, we skip the dipped bead and sew through the sticking up bead. Pick up a bead, skip the dipped bead, sew through the sticking up bead. And now we're at the easy end where we do a regular peyote turn by picking up a bead, skipping the dipped bead, and sewing through the sticking up bead. Pick up a bead, skip a bead, sew through a bead. And now we've come to the end where we need to make another turn. We pick up a bead, and we sew back diagonally through these first 3 beads. And we need to move our thread back around to come out of this bead that we've just added. We sew down into the bead below the one we're coming out of and up diagonally into the bead next to it. We then sew down diagonally through the second bead down in the last column. We then sew back through the last bead from the previous row, and we're back into position to start a new row. Pick up a bead, we skip the dipped bead and sew through the next sticking up bead. Pick up a bead, skip one, sew through one. Now we come to the end where we do a regular peyote turn by picking up a bead, skipping a bead and sewing through the next bead. Pick up a bead, skip a bead, sew through the next bead. Now we come to where we need to do another turn. We'll look at a different turn. This is called the loop turn. Instead of picking up a bead, we sew down diagonally through the last bead in the end column. Now we pick up a bead and we sew back through that last bead, making a loop. and we sew back through that bead we've just added, getting us into position for a new row. We pick up a bead, skip the dipped bead and sew through the next sticking up bead. Pick up a bead, skip one, sew through one. And we're back to our regular peyote turn. Pick up a bead, skip the dipped bead, sew through the sticking up bead. Pick up a bead, skip the dipped bead and sew through the sticking up bead. And back into position to do our next turn. We sew down through the last bead in the end column. We pick up a bead and sew back through that last bead, making a loop. We then sew back through that bead we've just added, getting us back into position to start our new row. If you want, you can sew back through the 2 beads again to reinforce the work. We pick up a bead, skip the dip bead, sew through the sticking up bead. Pick up a bead, skip a bead, go through the next bead. And back to our regular peyote turn. Pick up one, skip one, sew through one. Pick up a bead, skip a bead, sew through the bead. Now I'm going to show you our final turn. This is called the faux brick stitch turn. You will need to begin your first odd turn using either the figure 8 or loop-the-loop turn, but the faux brick stitch can be used for subsequent rows. For the brick stitch, pick up a bead and you want to sew under the thread bridge between the last 2 beads on the final column. We then sew back through the bead we just added, getting us back into position for our next row. Pick up a bead, skip one, sew through one. Pick up a bead, skip one, sew through one. And back to our regular peyote turn, we pick up one, skip one, sew through one. Pick up a bead, skip a bead, sew through a bead. And back to our turn, we pick up a bead and we sew under the thread bridge between the last 2 beads in the end column. We then sew back through the bead we just added, getting us back into position to start our new row. We then carry on with our regular peyote stitch. Keep going until you reach your desired length. The method of turning is up to you. While the loop-the-loop turn is quicker and uses less thread, the figure 8 turn is stronger. The faux brick stitch turn is also quite strong, but it will leave a thicker thread path on one side of your work. These are all things to consider when choosing your preferred turn. And that's how to do the odd count peyote.